Asitit 1. The Eviction Copy. It was the 17th of November in 1885, and the Colorado high country had already laid down its first snow. The Cache la Poudre River ran cold and dark in the bend below the Beaumont homestead, and the cottonwoods at the gate were bare and gray. Clara Beaumont had been a widow for 8 weeks. Her husband Samuel had been killed on the Poudre in late September when a logging chain snapped and a 60-foot lodgepole pine rolled across him at the riverbank. The funeral had been small. The Methodist circuit rider, 4 men from the timber crew, the storekeeper Mr. Tobias Pell, and Clara and her 7-year-old daughter Eleanor, whom everyone called Nora. Samuel's only living family was a half-brother named Dalton Reeves who lived in Boulder and who had not come. Clara had run the homestead alone for those 8 weeks. She had brought in the late hay, wintered the cows and the team, laid the stove, walked the fence line. She had not yet learned the trick of doing those things and not crying, but she had learned the trick of doing them and not stopping. The 3 riders came up the lane at 2:30 in the afternoon, a buckboard wagon behind them. The man in the lead, in a tailored charcoal 3-piece suit with a gold pocket watch on a chain across the waistcoat, was Dalton Reeves. The 2 men flanking him were not introduced. One had a Winchester rifle across the pommel, the other had a holstered revolver and a coil of rope. Clara stepped out onto her porch and met them with her hands folded in front of her apron. Dalton Reeves dismounted. He produced from inside his coat a folded document on heavy stock and said, in the careful voice of a man reading from a script he had rehearsed, that the probate court of Larimer County had confirmed his claim as Samuel's nearest male heir. The homestead passed to him by the law of inheritance. He had come to take possession. He gave Clara until sundown to gather her personal effects. Clara read the document. It bore a seal that looked correct. She did not have an attorney. She knew only that Samuel, the spring he filed the patent in 1881, had told her he had filed it under her maiden name for safekeeping in case anything ever happened. She had thought he meant disease, not brothers. Clara did not argue. She walked back into the cabin and packed a single small wooden trunk. She took the silver oval locket with Samuel's portrait, Nora's rag doll Mabel, and the lockbox from under the kitchen floorboards holding $14 in coin and the marriage certificate and Nora's birth record. She did not take the linen Samuel's mother had embroidered. She did not take the rifle that Dalton's man was now leaning against the porch rail. Nora did not cry. Nora watched her mother and held the rag doll Mabel by one yarn-haired arm and learned in that hour the lesson her mother was learning, that there are men who will smile at a funeral and ride up a lane 2 months later with a seal on a folded paper. By dusk, the buckboard was rolling down the wagon track toward Fort Collins. Clara in the seat beside one of Dalton's men, Nora in her lap. He dropped them at the depot platform without a word. Clara bought 2 third-class tickets to Denver. The train pulled out at 9:14. She held Nora against her chest and watched the dark Colorado prairie slide past the window and did not let her face change once. Act 2. The Train East. Copy Denver in late November of 1885 was a city of mud and gas lamps and brick. Clara stepped down onto the platform of the Union Pacific Depot at 5:30 in the morning with $13.40 in coin and a sleeping 7-year-old in her arms. She knew no one in Denver. She had been to the city twice in 11 years, both times with Samuel, both times to sell cattle. She walked down Curtis Street with Nora half awake against her shoulder until she came at last, at a corner of Larimer and 16th, to a tall, narrow brick building with a hand-painted sign that read, Carrington House, rooms, meals, fair prices. The woman who answered the door was black, 62 years old, with silver-streaked black hair pulled into a tight bun. She wore a high-collared navy wool dress with a lavender knit shawl pinned at the shoulder with a silver brooch, and small wire-rimmed spectacles on a fine chain. Her name was Mrs. Ophelia Carrington. Mrs. Carrington looked at Clara. Mrs. Carrington looked at the sleeping child. Mrs. Carrington looked at the small wooden trunk on the boardwalk. Then she stepped back from the doorway and said, "Come in out of the cold, child." For the first month, Clara washed linens in the backyard of the boarding house in exchange for a small attic room with a single iron frame bed. Nora slept in the bed beside her. Mrs. Carrington fed them at the boarders' table without comment and without charity in her face. Clara learned in those first weeks that Mrs. Carrington had come to Denver as a freed woman from Tennessee in 1867, that she had buried a husband and 2 grown sons, and that the boarding house had been her own work for 18 years. In the second month, Mrs. Carrington noticed Clara doing the boarding house ledger one evening at the kitchen table, by the light of a single oil lamp, and not making a single error. Mrs. Carrington said, "You can read accounts." Clara said yes. Mrs. Carrington said, "Then you'll keep mine." The wage was small. The room was the same attic, but the work was clean, and Nora began by Christmas to laugh at things again. Clara did not laugh. Clara did not cry either. Clara kept the ledger and walked to the post office twice a week to mail letters to a Fort Collins attorney named Mr. Levi Halstead, who answered each letter politely and explained that contesting a probate claim required money she did not have. She was not yet ready to give up. She was not yet ready to win. She was waiting. Act 3, The Surveyor's Memory, copy. The man Henrik Lindqvist took a room at Carrington House on the 17th of January, 1886. He was 38 years old, a federal land surveyor working out of the Denver office of the General Land Office, in town for the winter on rotation. He had ash blonde hair cropped short and a neatly trimmed square ash blonde beard, pale gray-blue eyes, and the broad-shouldered 6'1" build of a man who worked outdoors in all weathers. He wore a tan canvas duster over a blue chambray shirt and dark gray trousers tucked into knee-high brown boots, and he carried a worn leather satchel of brass survey instruments and rolled paper maps. He spoke English carefully, with a light Scandinavian accent. He paid 2 months in advance. For 3 weeks he ate at Mrs. Carrington's table, tipped his hat to Clara each morning, asked her after the weather, and said nothing more. He worked late at the GLO office on Stout Street and came in at supper smelling faintly of India, ink, and saddle leather. He did not look twice at her, and she did not look twice at him. It was at the supper table on the 8th of February, 1886, that Mrs. Carrington, ladling soup, said to him, "Mr. Lindqvist, this is Mrs. Beaumont. Mrs. Beaumont keeps my books." Mr. Lindqvist looked up at the name. He set his spoon down. He said very carefully, "Beaumont? Of the Cottonwood Bend patent? On the Cache la Poudre?" Clara felt the small dining room go very still. She said yes. She said her late husband, Samuel, had filed the patent in 1881. Henrik Lindqvist looked at her for a long moment. He said, "I am the surveyor who ran your section. I remember the patent. It was filed under the name Beaumont for the wife. Your husband was very particular about that." The next morning, Henrik Lindqvist walked Clara 6 blocks through the snow to the General Land Office on Stout Street. He produced from a locked cabinet his original field notes from the Cottonwood Bend section, dated June of 1881, and a certified GLO copy of the patent itself. The patent was issued in plain ink on heavy stock to one Clara M. Beaumont, sole patentee. There was no joint tenancy. There was no marital community provision. Samuel Holloway Beaumont, for that had been his legal name before her, was named only as the resident grantee for the purposes of the homestead improvement requirements. The land was, and had always been, hers. Clara stood in the GLO office with the certified copy in her hand and the snow falling past the high window, and did not cry. She had not cried at the eviction. She had not cried on the train. She did not cry now. She folded the paper carefully and put it inside the cover of her boarding house ledger, and she walked back to Carrington House through the snow with Henrik Lindqvist a step behind her. And she said when they reached the porch only, "Thank you." He tipped his hat. He said, "It was Mr. Beaumont who was particular. I only wrote the field notes." Act 4. 3 Winters of Work. Copy. The Denver attorney, Mr. Levi Halstead, when Clara presented her certified federal patent in March of 1886, told her that the case was simple and the case would not be cheap. Bringing an ejectment suit in the Larimer County Court against Dalton Reeves would require a filing fee, a private investigator to certify the forged probate, deposition costs, court costs, and an attorney's retainer. Mr. Halstead estimated the total at $420. Clara had at that moment, in coin and notes, $31.45. So she worked. She worked the spring of 1886, keeping Mrs. Carrington's books at $6 a week. She worked the summer doing piecework bookkeeping for a Curtis Street millinery and a freight company at the rail yards. She worked the fall teaching Sunday school numbers at the African Methodist Church on Stout Street, and the long winter doing the books for a Polish butcher on Larimer, who paid her in coin and in cuts of pork that Mrs. Carrington roasted for the Sunday table. By the spring of 1887, she had $210 saved and Nora had turned 8 and could read the ledger over her mother's shoulder. By fall, she had $340, and Henrik Lindqvist had been gone on a survey rotation in Wyoming for 7 months and had written her, in small, careful hand, every fortnight. By the winter of 1887 to 1888, she had $430. She walked to Mr. Halstead's office on the 17th of January, 1888, and laid the money on his desk in a sealed envelope. Mr. Halstead counted it. He looked at her over his spectacles. He said, "It will be enough?" He drafted the ejectment complaint that night. The complaint was filed in the Larimer County Court on the 3rd of February. Mr. Halstead's investigator returned within 2 weeks with 2 sworn depositions, one from a Larimer probate clerk bribed in October of 1885 to enter Reeves's forged claim into the docket, and a second from a clerk in the Boulder chambers of Judge Theron Mackey, describing a $1,000 promissory note signed by Reeves and accepted by the judge in exchange for a quiet probate ruling. Clara waited through February. She waited through March. The hearing was set for the 14th of April, 1888. On the morning of the 11th of April, 1888, she packed a single carpet bag, tied the certified federal patent and the 2 affidavits and the deposition into a leather portfolio with a small brass buckle, kissed Mrs. Carrington's cheek, and took a seat beside Nora on the northbound train out of Denver. The train pulled out of Union Station at 7:30 in the morning. Clara did not look back. Act 5. Riding Home Copy. The train reached Fort Collins at 4 in the afternoon on the same day. Clara took 2 rooms at the railway hotel that night and slept 4 hours and was up before dawn. She rented a horse and a small 2-seat trap from the livery on Linden Street. She tied her carpet bag and the leather portfolio behind the seat. She lifted Nora into the trap. She drove out of Fort Collins on the wagon track north before the sun cleared the eastern ridges. The road to Cottonwood Bend ran 22 miles up the Cache la Poudre. Clara had ridden it 200 times in her 11 years on the homestead. She knew every crossing and every ford. She knew where the road dipped through the cottonwoods at the 3rd Creek and where the limestone outcrop stood above the river at the 5th. The horse was fresh, and the morning was cold and clear, and the prairie smelled of wet sage and the first green grass of April. Nora rode beside her with the rag doll Mabel under one arm and a small canvas satchel under the other. She had not asked in 2.5 years when they would go home. She had learned in that time to wait for her mother to know when. She watched the river through the cottonwoods and said only once when they crossed the 3rd Creek, "I remember this water." They reached the rim above Cottonwood Bend at noon. Clara stopped the horse. The homestead lay in the bend of the river below them, the cabin, the barn, the small corral, the willow at the gate. From a half-mile away, it looked exactly as she had left it in November of 1885. Smoke was rising from the chimney. There was a man in the dooryard splitting wood. He was not Dalton Reeves. He was one of the men Reeves had brought up the lane that November day, 2.5 years before. Clara did not drive down to the homestead. Clara drove the trap into Cottonwood Bend, the town, 2 miles farther up the river. A single lane of 6 buildings with a general store at the head of it and a small boarding house at the foot. She tied the horse at the rail in front of the general store. She lifted Nora down. She told Nora to wait on the bench outside the door with Mabel. She walked into the general store with the leather portfolio under her arm. The man behind the counter was Mr. Tobias Pell. He had run the store for 20 years. He looked up at her over his small, round, wire-rimmed spectacles, and his face did not move at all. Act 6. The Store Confrontation Copy. Mr. Tobias Pell said, "Mrs. Holloway." Clara said, "Beaumont. The name is Beaumont. It always was." Mr. Pell looked at her for a long moment. He said, "I'd heard you'd gone to Denver." Clara said, "I have come back." Mr. Pell did not answer. There were 3 other people in the store, a hand from the 3 Bar Ranch buying a sack of flour, an elderly woman buying pins, and a young man Clara did not recognize, leaning against the door frame with his arms crossed. The young man looked at her. He looked at the leather portfolio under her arm. He stepped quietly out of the store and crossed the lane at a fast walk toward the boarding house at the foot of the street. Clara understood. She had expected it. She set the leather portfolio on the counter. She said, "Mr. Pell, before I am interrupted, I want a witness. Will you read this and tell me what you read?" Mr. Pell unfolded the certified GLO patent on the counter. He read it through twice. He looked at the seal. He looked at the date. He looked at Clara. He said, "This is the federal homestead patent for the Cottonwood Bend section, in your name, issued 1881. Clara said yes. Mr. Pell said, "Mrs. Beaumont, this is your land. I do not understand." Clara said, 2.5 years ago, Mr. Reeves rode onto my place with 3 men and a probate paper. The probate was forged. I've come back with the GLO original and a deposition from the Larimer clerk who logged the forgery, and another from Judge Mackey's chambers." Mr. Pell did not speak for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "I always wondered." The door of the general store opened. Dalton Reeves walked in. He had the same balding, sandy blonde hair, the same cold, ice blue eyes, the same charcoal 3-piece suit with the gold pocket watch on a chain across the waistcoat. He had aged 3 years and 2.5. He looked at Clara across the store, and his face did not change. He smiled. He said, "Clara, I was told a woman had come up from Fort Collins with a leather case. I might have known." Clara did not smile back. Clara did not raise her voice. Clara said, "Mr. Reeves, the probate you produced in November of 1885 was a forgery. The land at Cottonwood Bend is not Holloway land. It was patented in my name in 1881. I have come for it back." Dalton Reeves laughed. It was a small, dry laugh. He said, "You have come for it back. With what? That paper?" He glanced at the GLO patent on the counter. "Clara, there is no court in Larimer County that will entertain that paper. I've seen to it that no court will." Clara said, "Then it is well I have come with the marshal." ACT 7. The Courthouse Reckoning. Copy. The door of the general store opened a second time. The man who stepped through was 49 years old, lean, 6 feet, with salt and pepper hair under a wide-brimmed brown Stetson, a full salt and pepper mustache, gray-blue eyes, and the weather-tanned skin of a man who had spent 30 years on horseback. He wore a long brown duster over a dark gray vest with a tarnished tin star pinned to the lapel, white shirt, brown trousers, sturdy brown boots. A single-action Colt revolver rested in a worn leather holster on his gun belt. His name was Marshal Bram Caldwell of the United States Marshal Service for the Northern District of Colorado, and he had ridden up from Fort Collins that morning at Mr. Levi Halstead's request. Marshal Caldwell tipped his hat to Clara. He said, "Mrs. Beaumont, Mr. Pell." He looked at Dalton Reeves. He said, "Mr. Reeves, I'd like to see the probate paper." Dalton Reeves's face moved at last. He said, "The paper is in my office at the homestead." Marshal Caldwell said, "Then we will ride together to the homestead, and you will produce it for me." The four of them, Marshal Caldwell, Clara, Dalton Reeves, and Mr. Tobias Pell, who had asked very quietly to come along as witness, rode the 2 miles to the homestead. Clara drove the trap with Nora beside her. Reeves rode beside the marshal. Mr. Pell drove his own buggy. They reached the dooryard at 3 in the afternoon. The man splitting wood looked up and saw the marshal and set his axe down and stepped back without a word. Reeves walked into what had been Clara's kitchen and came out with a folded paper. The marshal took it. He read it. He compared the seal on the paper with the seal on the certified GLO patent Clara had handed him in town. He compared the signatures. He compared the dates. He folded both papers and tucked them inside his duster. He said, "Mr. Reeves, the seal on this paper does not match any probate court in this territory. I have depositions in my saddlebag from a Larimer clerk you paid in October of 1885 and from a clerk in Judge Theron Mackey's Boulder chambers describing a $1,000 note signed by you. I am placing you under arrest for forgery, fraud, and conspiracy." Dalton Reeves did not run. Dalton Reeves did not draw a weapon. Dalton Reeves stood in Clara's dooryard in his charcoal 3-piece suit and looked at her once, across the yard, with an expression Clara would remember to the end of her life. He said, "Clara." And then he said nothing more, because the marshal had taken him by the elbow and was walking him toward the marshal's horse. The man with the axe was placed under arrest 20 minutes later as accessory. Judge Theron Mackey, in Boulder, was served a federal warrant by a deputy 3 days afterward. His commission was suspended within the week. Act 8. Closing Monologue Copy. That night, Clara Beaumont slept in the cabin her late husband Samuel had built for her on the Cache la Poudre. She slept on the same iron frame bed. She slept under the same hand-pieced quilt that Samuel's mother had left her. Nora slept in the small trundle bed beside her, with the rag doll Mabel under one arm and the small canvas satchel under the other. The willow at the gate moved in the April wind, and the cottonwoods on the riverbank moved with it, and the horse in the corral nickered once in the night and was quiet, and Clara, lying awake in the dark of her own house, did not cry. You will be told, in this country and in any country, that justice is a thing you walk into a courthouse and ask for and receive. That is not how justice is given. Justice in this world is given to the woman who walks out of her own home with a single trunk and a sleeping child in her arms, and who keeps walking. Justice is given to the woman who sits at a kitchen table in a city she does not know by the light of a single oil lamp and learns the columns of a ledger she has never seen before. Justice is given to the woman who answers a Fort Collins attorney's letter every fortnight for 2.5 years, and who, when he tells her at last the price of the suit, says only, "I will earn it," and then earns it. There's an old saying that says the wheels of justice turn slowly. The wheels of justice do not turn at all. They are turned by hand in the dark, by women who have nothing left but the certainty that what was theirs was theirs. They are turned by Swedish surveyors with steady hands and field notes, by black widows with attic rooms above butcher shops, by clerks who at last agree to sign a deposition, and by marshals who keep their own counsel and remember. A deed of paper is worth in the end only as much as the deed of the life that earned it back. Clara Beaumont rode home with both, with the certified federal patent in a leather portfolio with a small brass buckle, with 3 winters of Denver work in the lines under her eyes, and with a daughter who had learned in those 3 winters that the men who smile at funerals are not always the men who keep faith with the dead, and that the law, when it comes, often comes the long way around, on horseback, and only after a woman has carried it most of the road herself. In the morning, when the light came up over the cottonwoods and the river ran cold past the gate, Clara rose before her daughter, stepped out onto her porch, and stood in her own dooryard. And she said to no one and to the willow and to the morning only this, "I am home.